Truth is a tricky thing. It's a concept innately human and perhaps best defined by its exact opposite, an untruth, a lie, or whatever you wish to call it. When it comes to us, we're human beings, social creatures living in an absurd world, and the truth content in what a person says and what they do is an essential component for any healthy relationship. We see the truth we tell each other as something objective in a world of otherwise uncertainties, despite how fluid and subjective a term such as truth can be. An established truth, or untruth even, based on the trust or distrust between two people, as opposed to the truths or untruths spoken about in terms of politics, economics, metaphysics, and society, are very different things. To try and justify something as objectively true or false is typically the domain of ideological extremism and not rationality. Today's world is a big one, a world that overshadows individual human beings and zooms out of our little lives. It's also a world in which manipulating the already subjective big truths about how the world works has never been easier. In a big world such as ours, there are billions of narratives floating around about what's really going on. It might be whether or not your partner is being faithful to you, whether that lump you found in the shower is anything to be worried about, or ultimately something macro, like what really goes on behind closed doors when all those global leaders and business execs meet up at that ski resort in Switzerland every year. But I digress. No matter the question, you will always wish to find out the most truthful answer to it, right? Well, the good and bad news is that opening up any of the apps that make up the social internet will provide you with no shortage of theorists with their own answers. The problem is human beings often misinform one another for personal gain. Now, these bad actors across the internet are arming up with artificial intelligence, deepfakes, and an arsenal of other tools to generate fake news and commit online crime and fraud, robbing people and entities out of billions. So the question stands, who do I believe on the internet? In the past, the way we interacted with the media and the mainstream narrative was completely different. The further you go back in time, the more top-down the information architecture tends to be, unless you rewind all the way back to pre-agricultural times, where there was no mainstream narrative or wider information space. Supposedly, narratives about how the world worked were historically the domain of spiritual leaders. This had a tendency of inflating the value of religious institutions on pre-modern societies until the industrial age came about and ushered in a spike in secularism. Although it took a few centuries, the modern age was ultimately brought into being by the improved ability to share information, which in turn allowed people to bypass religious institutions for answers to how and why questions about the universe they lived in. The Enlightenment and Industrial Revolutions owe their existence to the invention of a technology that finally allowed the construction of narratives about what was really going on to decentralize a little bit. The printing press is an example which demonstrates the importance of information technology as a means of radically changing the structure of the human information space. With every technological breakthrough that affects how and what information we share, mankind must remain cautious of the impact that it can have in the long run. Think about it like this. Humankind spent millennia struggling with the simple issue of epistemic inequality, knowledge inequality, in the form of mass illiteracy. With one simple invention, books, you get the modern age. The mobilization of millions of people through education who would have otherwise never been able to express themselves. And with another, more complex series of inventions, we ushered in a digital age in just another century, which changed our world beyond recognition in the fraction of a lifetime. Ian comments, as my grandmother flicks between TEDx talks and episodes of The Office, overwhelmed by the volume of choices that her legally grey IPTV box offers, she mumbles to herself about a time begone when there were but a few TV channels or radio stations that made it to our post-colonial island. Try as she might, there is definitely too much content to get through in her lifetime by now. Beautifully written, and Ian is right. For a few generations after the war, that was about it. In the legacy information space, one could argue that the people were more prone to being deluded of the truth, which on paper seems correct. Everything was more top-down, controlled and censored. Sure, but there is a paradox in the nuances that appear when you compare this to the pluralist, digital media landscape of today. No, you might say, the censorship is still there. Those insert Jews/lizard people/aliens/Klaus Schwab and the World Economic Forum/Bill Gates/Clintons et al. Run the whole thing and have done for a while. This is no longer fringe stuff. Like, I know a lot of people who say and honestly believe this kind of stuff. And yes, the information space we live in is constrained by countless companies who have a stake in the means of running and sustaining these platforms. Absolutely, 100%. Yes, they do in fact manipulate them for money, power, and whatever. Old news. News flash though, the way they warp the narrative today is wildly different. How? Because the system has been flipped upside down and has decentralized since the days of radio, newspapers, and TV, creating a bottom-up effect, where there used to be a top-down one. And currently, the amount of narratives at the base isn't getting smaller. So naturally, the administrators of this slightly anarchic information space find themselves in a precarious position. The modern media landscape is in stark contrast with the media landscape of the 1950s, 60s, and 70s. Where legacy media had broadcasting institutions that did a bit of everything by entertaining and informing the public, they also hired comparatively small collections of staff to give a platform to. A platform, by the way, which reached millions of people. However, today's media platforms are also broadcasting institutions, but instead of hiring small collections of content creators, they accommodate millions, if not billions, of contributors, all creating and consuming content in one giant ecosystem. And they do it mostly for free, but at the same time they hold immense power in modern society. So here's the question. When the media landscape decentralized and digitalized into social media, did we get closer to reaching some sort of objective truth? Did everything become more transparent in public or less so? Is public attention and opinion today undivided and capable of supporting real activism, or is it perhaps too fractured? Throughout the 2010s, early bird platforms such as Meta, then Facebook, X, then Twitter, and YouTube, then YouTube, played a game of catch-up with the regulation of harmful content on their platforms. With the rapid expansion of their user bases, this proved to be a huge task to say the least. However, in recent years, content management on these platforms has become front-page news. Shadow banning, cancellation, fake news, and many more are hallmarks of the failures of the administrative practices of the modern media company, or social media company. The truth is that the media giants today largely control the content on their platforms via automated software. This is by and large not a perfect system, but despite being a bit one-size-fits-all, it largely prevents super harmful content from flowing through. That is, until you start seeing porn and adverts for illegalities in your feed, you basically know it's working. So how do all these systems work? Well, thanks to AI, okay? And what is AI? Well, AI is ultimately a computer system with no real consciousness and on enough steroids to turn mini Khabib into literal Khabib. That is, it is running on a lot of computing power. It can also learn to spot patterns and then make decisions based on what it has learned. And, although it is far from perfect, it can do the job of thousands of content administrators, saving companies billions. So, how does it hurt democracy and liberalism? One of the main issues with AI is that AI is not the miracle pill it is being made out to be by many of its greatest critics and proponents. Despite being cutting edge right now, it seems to be far from complex enough to understand the nuances of human behavior, particularly on a macro scale. Content on platforms we use every day is distributed via AI, which distributes information based on how likely it is to provoke you into interacting with it. And although there are safety mechanisms in place, the current model of content distribution is a bit too profitable as it stands. The issue is that even when platforms recognize that the AI cannot reasonably oversee such a volume of information without some errors, there is usually a shortage of human administrators as an auxiliary backup system to prevent harmful content from entering the mainstream. Furthermore, if companies try taking too much action, they come under fire by critics from both sides of the polarized political spectrum, accusing them of censorship. The global reach of these platforms and their mechanically flawed and socially irresponsible standard operating procedures inevitably results in oil spills. Smaller countries outside of the West and the Anglosphere experience much more harmful content slipping through the cracks of social media platforms than those within it. The issue with smaller states in globally insecure regions and situations is that they tend to have politically shaky climates. The internal stability in these countries is therefore at a higher risk if there is no proper social media administration. And yes, on the occasions that the system does in fact prevent spreads of disinformation, the targets of such crackdowns will always claim to be martyrs in the face of neoliberal Big Brother censorship campaigns. But this is mostly the case in parts of the world where social media companies are obligated to care and listen to their users. In countries where they're less constrained about ethical administration, companies such as Meta's Facebook and other Silicon Valley giants came under fire for knowingly allowing dangerous content to surface on their platforms in African countries with shaky security situations. In Ethiopia, for example, Facebook batted an eye to militia groups using the site to further their political objectives amid a raging civil war. The social media giant ranks Ethiopia in its highest priority tier for countries at risk of conflict, but the documents reveal that Facebook's moderation efforts were no match for the flood of inflammatory content on its platform, says the CNN report from 2021. Facebook and a few other platforms have outsourced a lot of auxiliary moderation to support centers based in more prosperous and stable African countries to have regional presence, but also to capitalize on immensely cheap labor prices. As a result, overburdened teams of moderators sift through traumatizing content such as child porn, incest, and other harmful stuff for as little as $1.50 per day. Meanwhile, on a completely separate continent, the small Central American country of El Salvador has recently elected its populist leader, Nayib Bukele, for a second term. Bukele is perhaps best known for imprisoning a sizable percentage of the population in order to deal with the country's gang epidemic, or for making Bitcoin a national currency. Regardless of how you have heard of him, he has coined himself the world's most popular dictator. A tech-savvy millennial by nature, he and many other populists across the democratic world are recognizing the importance of leveraging social media against their opposition. In small countries with a post-colonial legacy, it is sometimes imperative that legitimacy is somewhat derived from the approval of richer, more developed countries. Recognizing this, Bukele's social media team, amid a scramble for re-election, used Synthesia, an AI video generator, to synthesize a completely fictional Western media outlet praising the headway made by their controversial leader. With no coordinated administrative oversight from the platforms, the people of El Salvador largely bought it hook, line, and sinker. So did AI win the election for Bukele entirely? No, not entirely. For now, this serves as a warning about the challenges that await as AI becomes more mainstream and better developed. AI allows us to create artificial content that feels more real every day because it is learning every single day. In an age where AI runs the show beyond our LCD screens, digital literacy should be developed into a core subject throughout compulsory education if we wish to safeguard the legitimacy of the democratic process, for example. AI is capable of creating hyper-realistic entities on our screens that keep us company as lonely rates skyrocket in developed countries. It blurs the line between real and unreal to a point where nothing on the internet will be human anymore. Therefore, it's easy to imagine a future where it could become a machine populated by machines, regulated by them also, with the occasional nomadic human user wandering through the deserted internet to admire it for a moment. A standard practice for historians is the compilation of primary sources. A primary source to a historian is a source of information that originates from the event they are studying. Paintings by eyewitnesses, their diaries, and for a while photographs were considered totally empirical evidence as well. But doctoring images isn't something new. Throughout the past, paintings, drawings, and other representations of reality have been vandalized, edited, and mutilated, all in the hope of altering them so they no longer convey their original meaning. That being said, the manipulation of photographs in particular came into its own as a cultural phenomenon in the 20th century, an iffy practice by proto-public relations strategists taken up by your favorite dodgy regimes of the day. But despite this, the cost of editing photos was relatively high, and something that required a lot of time and skill to do compared to the age of Photoshop and AI-generated imagery. Yet still, humans see photos as empirical evidence, even in an age where a large portion of our information comes from a highlight reel on our phones. We'll believe it mostly when we see it. Generative AI, whether it generates text or imagery, is encroaching on the way we do work and the way we qualify people to work. 2 years on from its release to the mainstream, the impact of free generative AI is already being felt in the service economies of the West. Given that the most Western economies are based on providing value-added services, this means that as a product produced by tech giants, generative AI does not exist to simply aid the employee, but rather more so the employer. It is not a band-aid for the ruptured middle class, but potentially another leech for parasite executives and investors. Now, have you ever heard of bots? Well, they used to be primitive forms of generative AI that emerged a few years ago and are now at the front line of the battle against bullshit jobs. Bots are basically applied AI, software which is specialized to carry out a series of tasks after being trained on a set of data and often interacting with humans in the digital realm. Their development currently threatens banal jobs such as dealing with customers over frequently asked questions. If further developed, these systems threaten a wider demographic of workers' job securities, as the narrow band of remaining employees are taken on to oversee the AI. And this could just be the beginning, because bots aren't just dangerous to the economy, but for the political landscape of any democracy as well. Because the conversations we have about politics happen mainly on social media, an environment where interpersonal relationships just aren't very personal to begin with, lifelike AI disguised as real users poses a real threat. In terms of democratic understanding of how public opinion worked until AI, this is a disaster. Earlier on, YouTube's decision to remove the dislike button was something that disturbed this metric somewhat, and rustled the feathers of a lot of its user base. For years, one could tell how people felt democratically about a piece of content by looking at the ratio of likes to dislikes it had. On YouTube, the world's largest video sharing company, this is no longer the case. On Twitter, enough retweets, or on other platforms, enough likes, or hits as boomers call them, is enough to ride the waves of the algorithm with ease. But now there's another way. Your content does not need to generate an initial drive of real human engagement anymore. Now, you can pay companies to legitimize your content with thousands of fake accounts to trick the algorithm. They can also employ these bot/troll farms, as they've been dubbed, to chew up your critics in the comment section when they inevitably arrive to rain on your parade. A famous character who was linked to one of these notorious troll/bot farms was none other than Russian mercenary chief Yevgeny Prigozhin, who ran a separate company operating in Russia, which had at least 1,000 employees and called the Internet Research Agency. The Internet Research Agency was one of many entities which attempted to influence the 2016 US presidential elections and propagate the Kremlin's narrative throughout the internet. It allegedly ceased operations after Prigozhin's assassination last year. Now, detecting bots used to be a bit easier. They came in large waves and targeted specific content, with accounts being easily identifiable by their lack of original content such as photos and posts. These photos and other content which featured on the accounts was usually being stolen or shared from real-life users. But as generative AI becomes more streamlined into the systems of disinformation, the learning curve steepens. AI accounts could soon be populated with complex posts written by ChatGPT and pictures generated by Stable Diffusion. Worse more, these accounts can validate each other as they create ecosystems, making them even harder to detect as other bots like and comment elaborately on each other's social media. In 2016, a theory emerged from the nether areas of the internet that, in fact, the internet was not really populated by people. No, instead, the internet was populated almost entirely by bots. In 2016. A bit fringe, but I asked Ian to comment on this issue, and he philosophically concluded that at an earlier stage, a photograph could only serve as a representation of a person, evidence that they were there or simply were. At another level, in the age of the social internet, a few photos and posts on a profile create a virtual identity. It is not just your image that is on the internet. No, you are on the internet. The platforms are where we stand and cross paths, to see, speak to, and be with others. You do not need to don a weighty piece of headgear with brilliant screens, as the image is already part of reality. In the age where we live inside screens, it takes close to nothing to conjure an illusion of humanity. So how many bot farms would it take for all of Twitter to be dull swathes of four communities arguing? That is what's up with dead internet theory. Some online video game servers, when empty, become populated with bots that give you someone to shoot at. Is that what the socials could become? A space where groups of bots meant to sway your vote or market goods and services gather around when no one is there to talk to you. It's worth making the point that an AI-generated image does not need to be perfectly lifelike to trick its users on a platform, nor does it always get posted or created with that bad intention. All it takes to misinform someone that isn't paying attention is something that catches their eye for a fraction of a second as they scroll. Without second thought, what they've seen becomes part of the narrative because there is already so much discussion and media floating around. Media literacy programs, which make sure young people grow up knowing to question the source of a web article, knowing that biases are never exempt from any story, exist. They do exist, and 3CL and its collaborators have long been dedicated to seeing such initiatives through. However, they're not common practice by any means, nor are programs which make sure folks outside the influence of educational institutions are on track. We are not ready for the damage that the scale of misinformation this age of generative AI can bring. Not long after the launch of ChatGPT, we gathered an audience of educators for a panel on generative AI and education. During the gathering, tech entrepreneur and lawyer Jejegat brought up that countries which weren't able to make the most out of the potential upcoming tools promised would quickly fall behind. But we cannot ignore how deeply the hooks of deceit and control could sink into vulnerable communities when the tools to materialize and spread lies are so accessible. We must prioritize awareness in people and the drive to be constructively critical. People must treat this skepticism as a practice and aid it through effective tools and methods to distinguish what's reliable and what's not, even when we can't tell who's real from who's a bot. In sum, there is no real way of predicting all the outcomes which AI can bring to the chaotic information space which hangs over the democratic and not so democratic world. AI poses a threat perhaps most directly to our ideas of what reality should look like. It undermines the "I'll believe it when I see it" attitude of how truth is seen in the public space. Disgraced politicians emerging from a scandal can now claim it was all a deepfake. All the while, government whistleblowers and investigative journalists can be undermined through the accusation of using generative AI and labeled as doing the bidding of our adversaries. This is the world we are entering, which is ultimately a world of fear. For as long as AI cannot detect AI in the information space, and even after that may or may not happen, we cannot reasonably hope to continue relying on anything or anyone beyond our screens as a source of truthful narratives about how the world works, how to live our lives, or anything else of importance. Perhaps the solution is simple. Perhaps we might try re-evaluating our understanding of truth, maybe not as something complex and elaborate, nor as something that can ever be complete or objective. And based on such a semi-Socratic approach to truth, maybe then we can humbly put on our jacket and head outside to brave a physical and digital realm which constantly lies to us. You should not be disheartened by this mess in the information space. You should keep learning. You should not believe in the narratives about when everything was prim and proper, and you should not take anything or anyone at face value until they sit down with you, face to face, and agree that neither you nor them are objectively right or wrong. The basis of true democracy and civilized debate is about overcoming the absurd within the world and ourselves, and ultimately being able to shake hands at the end of it all.